Muy buenas tardes, señoras y señores, invitados especiales. Los escritores Carlos Fuentes y Gabriel García Márquez acordaron donar el monto de las becas que el gobierno mexicano les concedió como creadores eméritos a la Universidad de Guadalajara para fundar esta Cátedra Latinoamericana que lleva el nombre del autor argentino Julio Cortázar. De esto hace 20 años. Estamos, pues, de plácemes celebrando el 20º aniversario de fundación de nuestra Cátedra Julio Cortázar. Desde entonces, esta cátedra ha cumplido su propósito de ser un espacio académico del más alto nivel internacional donde confluyen la imaginación, la razón y la crítica para propiciar el diálogo y la reflexión continuos sobre la sociedad y la cultura latinoamericanos en el orden mundial. Esta tarde tengo el honor de dar una muy cordial bienvenida al realizador, director de cine quebequense, país invitado de honor del Festival Internacional de Cine de Guadalajara, Denis Côté. Para hacer la presentación, la introducción de nuestro invitado de esta tarde, la semblanza correrá a cargo del profesor William Stroh, quien es profesor de la Universidad McGill de Montreal, Canadá, y ahí mismo dirige el Instituto Internacional de Estudios sobre Canadá. Le cedo la palabra entonces al doctor Stroh para hacer la presentación. Allá mismo, si gusta, esto es libre, libertad de cátedra, donde usted quiera.
Buenas noches, bonsoir, good evening. It's a very great honor for me to be here tonight to present Denis Côté. Let me just say, by way of introduction, that Denis Côté is, in my opinion, the most interesting director to come along on the Quebec scene in the last 25 years. I've thought this for a long time, and I've thought it even more. I've been even more convinced after having spent much of the last couple of weeks of looking at many of his films for the second and in some cases the third time. I would even go so far as to say that the cinematic oeuvre of Denis Côté has marked the last decade of Quebec cinema with as much force as perhaps that of Claude Jutras in the 1960s, the films of André Fautier, which I love very much, in the 70s, and so on. So wherein lies the importance of Denis Côté? I think, first of all, there is the absolute independence and originality of his cinema, which is exemplary. He's not the Québécois Cronenberg, he's not the Québécois von Trier, he's not even our Kaurismäki, although I've heard him described as all of these things by different people at different times. He does not belong to any obvious wave or generation easily identifiable. Maybe perhaps, as he himself has suggested, to that generation of Québécois directors who make films more international than parochial, more intellectual than folkloric. But maybe he'll have something to say about that a little later on. What I like very much, one of the things I like very much about Denis Côté is that his independence is not accompanied, as far as I know, by a contempt towards institutions. Côté does not hesitate to say in interviews just how much the Quebec policies in terms of film production make possible, in his view, an intellectual cinema which is not possible in many other places. And in fact, he prefers to work inside a system which helps him with financing rather than endlessly cease to transcend this system as many others might do. I think in this respect he is a very good model for filmmakers to come. He is one of the only directors I know of who says openly that he's happy to make films that find much of their principal audience in festivals. I'm a festival guy, he said to an Anglophone journalist. I think this underestimates the success, in fact, that several of his films have had, en salle, comme on dit. But I find it very refreshing that he is nevertheless able to recognize the place in our day, in our period, that the film festival occupies as a world institution of invention, of exchange, and of valorization. Denis Côté began his career as a film critic. The influence of this activity on his work as a director seems to me obvious more in his search for forms and subjects than any kind of obvious relationship to films made by others. And in this respect, I would say that Denis Côté is the opposite of a filmmaker like Quentin Tarantino, for example. It's very difficult to know in watching his films what other films or what other directors he loves or admires or seeks in some way to approximate. If Denis Côté is a cinéphile, as they say, and he's admitted having been so in interviews, his is a cinephilia whose roots lie in a love of forms, it seems to me, more than any negotiation of a relationship to the cinema of the past. And for this reason, I think he's very different from that other great Canadian filmmaker of our time, Guy Maddin. Much of the originality of Côté's films, then, comes from the fact that we find, at least I find, and it may be my own ignorance, very little intertextuality, very few references to other films. The conventions and cliches are not to be found there. His stories are of an absolute originality. His characters have nothing to do with the kinds of characters we previously have seen in Quebec cinema, like 40-year-old men in crisis, tragic immigrants, the person who's coming of age repeats or is analogous to the history of Quebec, and so on. All these lieux communs of Quebec cinema, which in some cases have been handled extremely well, in other cases not so well, are absent from the work of Denis Côté. Nevertheless, Denis Côté will admit having been initiated into cinema in watching horror films, he says, about cannibals and zombies. And he admits as well that this taste for horror persists in that menacing atmosphere that you can find running through the majority of his films. Horror is explicit in the monster that we see or that we don't see. I argued with my wife about this, in his film Nos Vies Privées. It is more implicit in the village characters
y está más implícita en los personajes de Vicky Flo o en el paisaje de sus estados nórdicos. Digamos que tanto hombres como mujeres pasan mucho tiempo tratando de ocultar un cadáver, como por ejemplo en los estados nórdicos o en la vie privée. Entonces, luego tenemos motivos hitchcockianos por excelencia que están ahí presentes cuando su obra no tiene nada que ver con Hitchcock. Si ustedes ven la obra de Denis Côté por un periodo corto de tiempo, les acabará gustando la manera en que se repite ciertos leitmotivs. A mí me encantan las secuencias, por ejemplo, que tienen lugar en moteles y en hoteles, carreteros, en la zona de Quebec. Entonces, eso lo vemos en Vicky Flo, también trabaja mucho en tiraderos, que vemos en diferentes de sus películas. Con frecuencia sus películas vemos muchos vehículos abandonados. Y también vemos lugares tanto cursis como alegres para disfrute popular, por ejemplo, una fiesta de boliche en curling, y vemos otros como en vestiaire, y además tiene muy presentes a los animales, a las aves, los insectos, las serpientes, que se nos quedan viendo y tienen un diálogo con nosotros en la mayoría de sus películas, como lo vemos claramente en Vestiaire, pero igualmente en otras películas. Ahora, esto me lleva a decir que lo social aparentemente no le interesa tanto a Denis Côté. A él lo que le interesa es más bien el individuo en sí, el personaje en sí. Estamos muy lejos de los retratos de suburbia, de portier, de los retratos de los profesionales de clase media, sino al ver muchas de sus películas por una segunda vez, a mí lo que me ha impactado es la frecuencia de escenas donde hay reuniones sociales, donde hay agrupaciones sociales, ya sea fiestas, torneos de boliche, reuniones en tabernas, etcétera. En lo que radica la originalidad de la obra de Denis Côté es que, a diferencia de las películas de otros directores, él afirma el valor de la vida colectiva, que es feliz e inocente. Entonces, por una parte, tenemos estos animales incomprensibles, salvajes, que tienen secretos personales y, sin embargo, están rodeados de vecinos amenazantes que van a poder hacer imposible cualquier resolución o reconciliación